Started, and I want to say greetings and welcome to all of you here with us in the room, and a hearty welcome to all of our virtuals who are out there watching live. And of course, you'll have a chance to download this conversation later on if you want to be seeing it and studying it for a further time. My name is John Hamry. I'm the president here at CSIS, and just wanted to say how grateful we are to have all of you here. You know, demographers estimate that in all of human history, going back, 200,000 years, there have been probably 117 billion people have lived on the planet over this period of time. Only the tiniest percent, 1%, 2% maybe, had the opportunity to live in a democracy. That's not the norm of history. You know, the norm of history is that people have to live their lives under authoritarian rule. And we have this astounding privilege to have been born in a democracy. We've inherited something that's so precious, and it's not really understood how precious it is. And the focus of our conversation today is going to be, how do we make this vivid and alive again so that we don't let this beautiful, wonderful thing just kind of disintegrate out of neglect. You know, Elie Wiesel once said, in a very different context, but he once said that, you know, the opposite of life is not death. The opposite of life is indifference. And that's probably the greatest issue that we have to wrestle with. We have to think about an indifference in our society because we're not focusing on it. Civics education is at the core of trying to make people not indifferent, but very caring about their own future. We inherited this astounding privilege of being in a democracy, but we have to keep it alive. And that's what we're going to talk about today. I want to say thank you very much to Richard Haas and to David Rubenstein for being here today. David is the most famous interviewer in America, and so he's going to lead this conversation. But before we do that, Suzanne Spalding. Suzanne is the genius that runs our program here, and this is part of her program called Civics at Work initiative. So please welcome Suzanne to the stage.
Thank you, Dr. Hamry, as always, for getting us off to such a strong start and helping to focus us on why this conversation is so vitally important, and for your support for the Defending Democratic Institutions Project and our Civics at Work initiative. Your deep commitment to an informed and educated public is reflected every day in the work that you lead here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and is particularly on display in the podcast series, The Engine Room of Democracy, which I encourage all of you to check out, in which Dr. Hamry discusses with foreign government officials and policymakers how the fundamental ideals of our constitutional democracy are actually applied every day, and why these ideals must remain the bedrock of our society. This commitment to our democracy is why I was so pleased to come to CSIS in 2017, when I left my position as Undersecretary for the Department of Homeland Security, where I had the great honor of leading the men and women who work so hard every day to protect our nation's critical infrastructure, those things we rely upon each and every day, against cyber threats, natural disasters, and sabotage. In 2016, that included our election infrastructure. And I came to CSIS with the understanding that the information operations we saw from Russia in 2016 were just part of a much broader, longer-term campaign to undermine the public's trust and confidence in our democratic institutions, to exacerbate that decline in trust, and to weaken our democracy. In a 2018 report on countering adversary threats to democratic institutions, and a 2019 report on Russian information operations targeting trust in the judicial system and the rule of law, we found that the underlying narrative being promoted in these information campaigns was that democracy is not just flawed and needing reform, which we know it is, but that democracy is somehow irrevocably broken and the individual is powerless to bring about change, and that there is more that divides us than unites us. It seemed clear to us that the most sustainable way to counter this pernicious messaging, regardless of its source, whether foreign or domestic, is to teach about our democracy, and importantly, about the role of the individual. That's civics. We need to remind Americans of all ages that the promise of democracy is not some myth of current perfection in its implementation, but rather its capacity for change. That's what distinguishes democracy from totalitarian and authoritarian regimes. We need to be the informed and engaged agents of that change to move us toward that more perfect union. If we can capture the shared aspirations that can bring us together to improve our communities, even through our disagreements. But we have allowed this understanding to atrophy. According to the latest National Assessment of Educational Progress, only 22% of 8th graders tested as proficient in civics. And it has been at that level for many years. So multiply that year after year after year, only 1 out of 5 of our high school, of our 8th graders are getting a good grounding in civics. The federal government spends today, on average, per student, for STEM education, $50. Until this year, for civics education, 5 cents per student. It's now up to maybe somewhere closer to 50 cents. We see the results in survey after survey. Reinvigorating civics is a national security imperative. And while we must make the long-term investment in K through 12, there's an urgent need to strengthen the civic knowledge, civic skills, and civic engagement of adults. Businesses can and must play a key role. The 2024 Edelman Trust Barometer showed that while public trust in democratic institutions continues to decline all around the world, businesses are among the most trusted institutions, and people generally trust their own employers even more. Moreover, as we'll hear today, business has a vested interest in sustaining democracy. This is why we launched the Civics at Work initiative here at CSIS, and we've been pleased to work with many of the folks here today to encourage businesses to become more engaged in the work of sustaining our democracy by advocating for civics education, by engaging their own workforces in ways that build this knowledge, skills, and engagement, and supporting civics activities in their communities. We developed a guide for businesses looking to engage their workforces, as well as a guide for developers of civics content to create or adapt materials specifically for adults. Going forward, we hope to develop a portal that will provide scenario-based learning for employees all across the country. And we are looking to develop ideas for bringing these civics concepts, particularly civic responsibility, into STEM education. Navigating these highly charged and polarized times, even in an area as fundamental as civics, can seem challenging to businesses. So today, we will hear from the business community about ways in which they have stepped up to the challenge. We hope that you will be inspired both by a sense of urgency of the task, but also with hope for the possibilities of meeting that challenge. I want to thank our funder for this event today, Thinkubator, and also Microsoft for its support. To kick us off, we have this incredible duo. David Rubenstein is co-founder and co-chairman of the board at the Carlyle Group, a business he formed in 1987. I first met David back in the 1980s when he was an attorney, working with my husband in a coalition, the Home Recording Rights Coalition, to represent disruptors in the film and television industries. David also served in government as Deputy Assistant to President Carter for Domestic Policy, and prior to that as Chief Counsel to the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee's Subcommittee on Constitutional Amendments. His public service, though, has not been limited to his time in government. David serves on many nonprofit boards and foundations, and we would be here all afternoon if I tried to list all of them. And the wild success of his business venture has been used to preserve and protect an amazing number of tangible reminders of the ideals, values, and value of our democracy, from original founding documents to places like Mount Vernon and Monticello, to the monuments that inspire us, including the Washington Monument, the Jefferson Memorial, the Lincoln Memorial. He has honed his interview skills over many years, including as president of the Economic Club, where he conducted over 130 interviews, and his PBS shows, Peer-to-Peer and History with David Rubenstein. Today, he is going to be engaging with Richard Haass. Dr. Richard Haass is a veteran diplomat and respected scholar of international relations. He has served for 20 years as the president of the Council of Foreign Relations, where he is now president emeritus. He's served numerous presidents, including at the State Department under Presidents George W. Bush and Ronald Reagan, at the White House under George H.W. Bush, and at the Pentagon under Jimmy Carter. He was envoy to the Cyprus negotiations and the Northern Ireland peace process. And after 9/11, he was U.S. coordinator for the future of Afghanistan. He's the recipient of numerous government awards and honorary degrees. Dr. Haass's commitment to helping ensure an informed and engaged citizenry is clearly reflected in his work at CFR and his prolific writing. He is the author and editor of 14 books on American foreign policy, 1 book on management, and 1 on American democracy. I should say 1 explicitly on American democracy. And the latter is why I reached out to Richard to take some time from his incredibly busy schedule to be with us today, and I'm so grateful to both Richard and David for finding time to make this work. At the end of his book, The Bill of Obligations, The 10 Habits of Good Citizens, Dr. Haass reminds us that we get the government and the country we deserve. Getting the one we need, he warns, is up to us. David and Richard will discuss what needs to be done and the role of the business community. They will be followed by a panel of business leaders, and we will conclude with a discussion about the importance of building support for the rule of law and the role the legal community plays in helping to sustain our democracy. And with that, David, over to you.
So, Richard, thank you very much for taking time to be here today. Given your background, for 20 years, you were the president of the Council on Foreign Relations. You've worked in several administrations, including the Carter administration, which many people didn't know. You were a young Defense Department person right then, but you've worked in senior positions in the George Herbert Walker Bush administration and the George W. Bush administration. But if we're at CSIS, many people would expect that you're here to talk about foreign policy or national security. Why are you on a panel to talk about civics and democracy? You're an expert in foreign policy, so why do you care about this issue?
I'll answer that in a few seconds. But I don't know about you, like when John Hamre gave the introduction, and for a second I was kind of feeling puffed up, like if he was saying there was 117 billion people who'd lived on Earth. I thought he was going to say something nice about the two of us.
Well, he couldn't think of anything nice to say about us, so he...
So there we go. We're 2 of 117 billion. Look, the quickest way to answer the question, David, and thank you for doing this, and thank you all for being here, is if you had a coin, and it was a national security coin, you know, one side of it is what you'd expect. It's foreign policy, defense policy, what have you. It's what we think of as national security. But the other side of the coin is domestic. And I don't think we can be effective or strong in the world if we're dysfunctional at home, if we're divided at home, if we're distracted by what's going on at home, so we don't have the resources, the bandwidth, the consensus. So I just don't see any longer how you can speak about national security and just think about, if you will, what's outwardly projecting.
All right, so Woodrow Wilson famously said we wanted to make the world safe for democracy. But when people look at our democracy, when we can't pass debt limit bills, we can't pass appropriation bills, we can barely pass foreign funding bills to save Ukraine or other kinds of foreign policy challenges. Why should people look at our democracy and say we should save the world for that kind of democracy? Why is our democracy so wonderful?
Well, I think they're saying it less and less, which is simply a cold reality. I think there's still respect, as there should be, for the American economy. And like, this is more your department than mine, but that's pretty, not perfect, but pretty impressive. But look, we can have a debate about whether Woodrow Wilson is right. I'm not a big fan of his presidency. Not that I was around at the time, but the idea that the purpose of American foreign policy is to promote democracy. I'm old-fashioned. I think the purpose of foreign policy is to influence the foreign policies of others, how they behave. But if we do want to influence the domestic functioning and nature of other countries, the best way is to do it by example. It's not by having State Department types lecture them about democracy. It's to show that democracy works, that it delivers, that it creates, the rule of law is good for the functioning of economy, that we make tremendous progress. And yes, we have our problems, but I think, for example, a great foreign policy move, if you will, if you're interested in promoting democracy, were things like the Civil Rights Movement. It shows that American democracy has the capacity to change. I think it was Suzanne said in her introduction, one of our comparative advantages is not that we don't make mistakes, is that we can fix them. And so, but right now, when people look at, you go through the litany you mentioned, David, and you didn't mention things like January 6th. What did Chinese television show on January 6th? They showed pictures of what was going on at the Capitol. And the Chinese used that as a justification for their authoritarian ways. So if we want democracy to have a chance around the world, we've got to show it excelling here at home.
Okay, so right now, historically, business people had the view that they should run their company to help the society a bit and certainly make profits. Then Milton Friedman came along in the 1970s and said, no, corporations have one obligation: make the most profit they can legally make, and don't worry about society and other kinds of things. Some people have challenged that, and the Milton Friedman view is not currently the zeitgeist of the era. But do you think that CEOs of companies or other people on boards of businesses, publicly traded businesses or private businesses, should do more to promote democracy as part of their obligation, or should they just say, look, I just worry about profits?
It's a big question, it's the right question, so I'm going to take a little bit longer, but the answer is a couple things. And the short answer is yes, they've got to focus on this. This is the oxygen. I mean, one of the great comparative advantages historically of business in this country is the rule of law. I mean, look, you've done extraordinarily well, but you make long-term investments. Well, you can only make long-term investments if you have a pretty high degree of confidence about what the world or the country is going to look like a number of years, and that the regulatory agencies, the legal agencies, the taxing authorities are going to basically play it straight. And so businesses, I think, have an extraordinary stake in American democracy. I spent years as the American envoy to Northern Ireland. I've seen what can happen to a modern society. I mean, Northern Ireland went through 3 decades of the so-called Troubles. It became a heroic thing to go to work or send your kid to school or whatever. Remember, David, years ago in Washington when you had that father and the son who were killing people who were pumping gas? Okay, so that to me was a warning in some ways. It showed how dependent we are, if you will, for law and order in our societies as businesses. So I think businessmen and women take it for granted at their peril. And by the way, the last I noticed, they're able to get involved with DEI. They're able to get involved with ESG. A lot of them have felt, that they felt pressured to speak out on, whether it was Black Lives Matter or October 7th. So I think we've gone beyond the purity of Professor Friedman's position. And I think they do have not just an obligation, but a self-interest. Businesses don't operate in a vacuum. So I think any business leader who doesn't take an active role in the resilience and quality of American democracy is not acting in his own firm's self-interest.
So in the year 2000, early part of this century, the National Science Foundation created a task force to figure out why the Chinese were doing so well in certain technology areas and so forth. And Norm Augustine, the chair of the commission, later came back and said, well, we weren't educating our young children enough in science and education, science and technology. So they developed a wonderful acronym called STEM, S-T-E-M. And everybody wants to be a STEM major, and every parent said, you better be a STEM major if you want to get a job out of college. If you want to go to something important like Goldman Sachs or something, you've got to be a STEM major. And so we shifted our education to STEM, and as a result, now what used to be 8% of the undergraduates in this country were history majors, now it's 2%. And similar kind of numbers for English and other kinds of things like that. And we don't really teach very much on civics and American history anymore. So the lack of civic education, as you study this, is it appalling to you that our young people can't really tell you things like how many branches we have in the federal government, who the first president of the United States was? Is this a sign of decay of our society, or just a sign that we're really good in STEM?
So, a couple of things I could say. I'm not against STEM, for the record. It's fine. But it's a little bit like musical chairs. That, we had to create more space for STEM at the table, and suddenly things like there were fewer chairs available for civics and history. I don't think there was an anti-civics or an anti-history movement. What happened was we created other priorities. They got the funding. Teachers' colleges went that way and so forth. And suddenly, when the music stopped, we didn't have a chair for civics or history at a lot of tables. So it wasn't. I don't think people set out to bring the current situation about, but it came out. It came out this way. All the same. So David, let me give you. Today is the last day of Passover, Jewish holiday where Jews around the world celebrate the Exodus from Egypt. And the reason Passover is so important to Jews is that for a lot of their history, Jews were denied access to houses of worship. Jews were exiled in diasporas. So they had to use this holiday, which is celebrated in the home. And you have this festive meal where everything is symbolic and follows a certain sequence. And the whole idea is that for older generations, it is their obligation to teach the history of this holiday, because this holiday is central to the identity of what it is to be a Jew. And that was the only way that Jews could increase the odds they would survive exile and anti-Semitism, discrimination, what have you. So here we are. I say this because here we are, the United States of America. We weren't a country that was founded upon a religion, just the opposite. It was freedom from religion, as much of anything else, as well as of religion. We weren't founded on a single race, though obviously we had racist elements into our founding and so forth, or a single gender, though again, I understand where we were at the time. But we were founded on ideas. So why do we somehow assume that these ideas will be there in perpetuity if we don't teach them? Why are we not conscious of the need of generation to generation, this transmission of our political culture? People don't come out of the womb as basically, reading the Federalist Papers, the last I checked. This is not something that's in our DNA. Democracy is something that can't be assumed. It has to be taught. It has to be demonstrated. So yeah, David, I think we are making a massive mistake, and in some ways a really reckless bet on our future, that we don't have to invest in the teaching of American democracy, but it'll still be here and it will still be robust. And I would actually think recent decades are evidence to the contrary, that we're already paying a price for our lack of teaching and our lack of not meeting our obligation to impart it from generation to generation.
So if somebody is overseas saying you brag about your democracy, that you don't say it's not without challenges, but you have a system for electing presidents where the majority vote does not matter. Recently, we had 5 cases where the majority winner, popular vote, did not get to be president. Mm-hmm. And the most recent election, somebody who lost by 7 million votes actually protested that part. Usually you would have the people who won the majority popular vote would be the ones who protested if they didn't get to be the president. This time we had the opposite. But why should somebody overseas say our democracy is so wonderful when somebody can be president of the United States when he or she doesn't get a majority of the popular vote?
2 things, 2 separate issues you raised. One is the norm of the peaceful transfer of power. That was one of the great hallmarks, one of our calling cards, and that's been basically put in jeopardy. So I think that's just a fact of life, an unfortunate one. What you raised, look, My enthusiasm for the Electoral College is finite. If I were designing the United States right now, I wouldn't necessarily build that in, certainly not the way it's currently structured. What it means is, I mean, here we are, we're 6 months before the election, and 90% of the campaigning is going to be in 6 states. So we're basically saying to the inhabitants of 44 states in the in District of Columbia, we know how you're going to vote. We don't have to bother. We may visit places like New York because it's a good place to raise money, but nobody visits New York, if you will, to get the popular vote in New York, because that's a foregone conclusion. So we've disenfranchised a lot of countries. So I'm not a great fan of it. On the other hand, the reason I wrote the book, I wrote another thing is there's zero chance. Not 0.1% chance, 0% chance this is going to be changed anytime soon. Any structural reform in American democracy is going to have winners and losers. The analogy I draw is the UN Security Council. It makes no sense that the UN Security Council looks the way it does. That you have these 5 countries that have permanent vetoes, and all sorts of other countries like Japan and Germany or what have you, India, aren't on the council. It makes no sense. But there is zero chance you would ever get the 5 who have the veto to agree to others getting their same position. Same thing with things like electoral college reform. There will be certain states, certain parties are going to push back against certain reforms because they're going to say we will be disadvantaged of it. So it's good you're all sitting down. This way you're not going to fall over. Shockingly enough, people who feel they are going to be disadvantaged by reforms tend to resist them, which is why that things like the Electoral College are baked into the cake right now.
So there are people living in countries around the world that seem to be quite happy with not having the kind of democracy we have. I mean, Abu Dhabi, for example, people seem to be quite happy there. Dubai, people are happy. Singapore has a democracy, but it's one party's in control for all the time. So why should our democracy be the one that everybody thinks is the wonderful one that should be the role model? Why not live in what's wrong with living in Singapore or some other type of semi-democracy where you don't have the kind of opportunities that we might have to vote for people, but on the other hand, you don't have all the challenges we have? Do you think that American democracy, in other words, is the model that everybody should follow, or you can be a democracy in other kind of countries and live quite happily?
I don't feel it's a one-size-fits-all model. That's a kind of cultural arrogance. Look, we have our democracy. What we have, it's in some ways a product of our own political culture, our own historical experience, and people forget. What we call the Constitution is the second Constitution. If you go, we had the Articles of Confederation. We experimented, didn't work so hot. So we basically, brought people together in Philadelphia. It was the great original bait and switch. We're coming here to amend the Constitution. Let's throw that out. Let's start over. And by the way, it just so happens that I have a Constitution prepared in my pocket to go forward. So, that made sense for us. The British and lots of countries in Europe, for example, lots of countries around the world have functioning democracies with strengths and weaknesses, various characteristics. You have countries, you mentioned the UAE or Singapore, that are more top-heavy, if you will, than us. And I think there's certain advantages and disadvantages that go along with top-heavy countries. So look, I don't. It's a kind of cultural and historical arrogance to say this is right for others. I think we've had a pretty good run, an amazing track record, but as everyone in this room knows, we've got our problems, our flaws, and also one of the lessons, it's almost like as people age and something, I don't mean to, this maybe cuts close to home for the two of us, David, but you get a kind of sclerotic tendencies. And I think that's true of this democracy. Things, as we get older as a democracy, we're not the same as we were. Look, when we were founded, when this Constitution was written, we had a country of 3 million people. We're now 340 million people. It's not a lot of organizations that go from a scale of 3 million to something 100 times that, and everything works just as well. So no, I don't think we're a recipe or a model, but I do think there's wonderful things about our Constitution, about our political system. There's impressive things about our history that others might be wise to be influenced by. But no, I don't think I don't think you can take what we've done here and export it.
When we were founded in 1776, there were 3 million people in this country. But only about 400,000 of them could vote.
Right.
You had to be a white Christian property-owning man. So there were 500,000 slaves, 1.25 million white women, 10,000 Jews, and about 500,000 non-property-owning Christian men. So out of 400,000 white Christian property-owning men, you got George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, James Madison, among others. Now we have 350 million people, and where do you think the James Madisons and George Washington, Thomas Jeffersons, they're all in private equity, or where are they go?
So what are the most successful institutions in American society? Well, one is the military. I think we have extraordinary talent in the American military. More than any other segment of American society, the military invests in its people and its training. It doesn't take it for granted. Virtually every other institution in America, I mean, academics is one of the worst. Or you assume because someone's a good professor, he or she's going to be a good dean. Why the hell would you think that? It's a very different muscle set. And I think we have a lot of proof that that proposition is probably wrong, but I digress. So coming back to, so I think sometimes military, I think people do go into business. I mean, you mentioned before Goldman Sachs. When I came of age, you and I are roughly the same generation. You and I both, our early jobs were government. To me, the big debates growing up in the 60s and 70s were public policy debates. I was a little bit too young for civil rights, but things about Vietnam and so forth. And that's what excited me. I think now a lot of the best and the brightest don't go into government. They look what happens. They say it's dysfunctional, it's terrible, you get criticized and all that, blah, blah, blah. Instead, they're more likely to go into private equity or investment banking. It took me 7 years to figure out to go into investment banking. But I think people,
right.
I think there's much more. I'd say one other thing. I think talented people do go into public service, but I think it's harder to excel now. I think the whole is less than the sum of its parts.
So when this country was started, when the Constitution you mentioned in Philadelphia, 1787, 4 months in Philadelphia, no air conditioning, so forth, but they didn't have a Bill of Rights, no Bill of Rights. Later, we got a Bill of Rights about a year or so later, but you have in your book on civics talked about a Bill of Obligations. What do you mean by obligations? How is that different than a Bill of Rights?
Look, for the record, I'm not against rights.
Okay.
Bill of Rights, as David knows better than anybody, were essential to get the Constitution ratified. That was part of the political bargain. People were worried about creating a much more powerful government with an executive. So part of the political deal was we need to have certain assurances about individuals and states, and that was essentially the first 10 amendments. My view is simply that rights, however necessary, are not sufficient. That a democracy will not flourish based on rights. Okay, at the risk of getting political, let's talk about what's going on our campuses. So people are saying rights to free speech, rights to protest, rights to do that. But what about people's rights on the other side? What about the right to be heard, or the right to go to class, or the right not to have to walk through an encampment? So my point is simply, rights inevitably clash. The rights of the unborn versus the rights of a mother to choose. Rights to gun ownership versus rights of public safety. You can't have a functioning democracy simply based on rights. There's got to be obligations, one of which is to be open to compromise. You've got to work out differences, civility, the rejection of violence. So I basically think that one of the reasons American democracy is in some of the trouble it's in is we've become so absolute in our rights and almost exclusively functioning on them. And we forgot that rights have to exist in this larger pool of interaction, some of which have to be obligations of two sorts, David. One is which everybody in this room has to one another, and the other is what everyone in this room has to this country. So we've got to balance, we've got to blend rights and obligations.
So how do you explain, when you go overseas and you talk about America and democracy, you get a lot of questions, no doubt. How do you explain to people that you have a House of Representatives controlled by one party, by one vote, yet it doesn't really have a coalition that's saying, well, we only have one vote majority, why don't we kind of work together with the other side? Why is it that you have people with an absolutist view with a one vote majority? How do you explain that to people overseas?
With difficulty. It's not much easier to explain it to people here. I actually think one of the interesting phenomena in America is the weakening of our parties. We think we're too partisan, but in a funny sort of way, parties were historically moderating instruments. And every politician now has almost become his or her own party. They have access to media, they have access to money. So it's harder and harder to get collective effort. And then because of the way we choose a lot of our candidates through closed primaries, so tiny percentages, so we'll choose candidates and so forth. And then because of gerrymandering, if you get the party nomination, you're likely to get elected. So a lot of now the way we structure our politics pushes people, if I may be permitted, now that you're a baseball owner, a football analogy, we're pushing people into the end zones. There's a lot of reward for end zone political behavior, much less reward for operating near the middle of the field.
All right, let's suppose we have a great democracy. The theory behind democracy, and we have a representative democracy, the theory behind a representative democracy is that people might vote for people that represent them. So how come we have, even in a presidential election, you only get about 61 or 2% of the people voting? In a, let's say, a city council election, you might get 3 or 4 or 5% of the eligible voters. Why are so few people voting, and historically haven't had that higher percentage of people voting? Why is that such a great democracy when people, almost half the people, aren't even voting?
Well, you're right. The statistics are exactly that. Maybe at best, close to 2/3 will vote this November. Less than 50% of eligible voters bothered to vote in the midterms. When we asked, the polls asked people why don't they vote, people have lots of reasons. Everything from my vote doesn't make a difference, I didn't like either candidate, I couldn't get off from work, I couldn't get childcare. And we don't make it easy in this country. We have elections on Tuesdays. We don't make it a national holiday. In lots of places, there's kind of implicit voter suppression. We don't have enough voting stations. The hours aren't good. In certain states, you can't, if it's hot out, you can't give people water to drink while they're waiting on line. So people find it physically challenging. So Australia, for example, voting is required. You're required to show up. You get fined if you don't show up at the polls. You can show up at the polls and deface your ballot, but you still have to show up at the polls, or you pay some fine. I don't know if it's $75 or $100 or whatever it happens to it. That wouldn't go down well in this country. We don't like being told we have to do things. So bottom line is, I think it reflects more the disillusionment. There's the physical difficulties of voting, and I think there's disillusionment with America. Most of people aren't willing to make the effort.
So why do you think it is, despite our problems with democracy and the way the government doesn't work so wonderfully, you've got 49 million people in this country who are immigrants to this country? Why are we attracting immigrants at a higher number than anybody else? I think Germany might be the second highest country with immigrants, about 5 million or something like that.
Two reasons. One is economic opportunity. That the economy still works here. It's impressive compared to much of the world. And the other is we still have lots of freedoms. And if you're coming out of a society that's either very poor or that is very repressive, the United States, for whatever flaws with the operations of our democratic system, still looks pretty good. And I think I think also, there's other reasons. American higher education is people don't line up at our consulates around the world to go to our public high schools, but they do line up to go to our universities. But I think mainly it's economic opportunity and it's greater individual freedom.
So there was talk when he was president of the United States that maybe Mount Rushmore could put his sculpture up there. That was Donald Trump talked about his being up on Mount Rushmore. But why is that not actually a reasonable idea, considering the fact that he's alerted to so many people that democracy that we have is structurally wrong, and he's taught us so many things that we didn't really know about before. So how do you comment on the fact that he's actually alerted us to so many of the flaws we have in our democracy and loopholes that maybe he actually deserves to get a lot of credit for letting us know more about our democracy than we thought? Any comments on that?
See, I've been speaking about these issues for a long time. That's a first, that question, my friend.
But he has alerted us, would you not say, to some flaws we have?
Yeah, but what's so interesting, and I'd be curious what you think about this. Yes, he's alerted us, but I think for a lot of Americans, if you ask Americans why are they going to vote however they're going to vote this November, what's the issue that's troubling them most? It's not democracy, it's the border. And Donald Trump has alerted people to some extent on that. So if Joe Biden gets defeated this November, I think probably the border policy It has more to do with it. Right now, it's not clear to me that, how do I put it, democracy will be affected, the degree of democracy we have will affect the election. It will in turn be affected by the election. But I'm not sure a lot of voters are going to show up at the polls voting that I need to vote this way or that based upon the future of American democracy. My sense is inflation, border issues. I think some of the stuff going on our campus is the sense that things are a little bit out of control. And it gets to a larger thing, David. You know, if you think about historically, at the risk of getting melodramatic, I get uneasy when people, democracy becomes a bit of an abstraction, but order is not an abstraction. And we have to be very mindful that people, I believe, you know, things like whether it's economic disorder, inflation, or physical disorder, 2 million people a year coming in overboard and large amounts of crime and homelessness. My guess is a lot of people will opt for economic and social order, physical order, before they will opt for democracy.
Okay, let me ask you about this week. In the remaining time, you're one of the leading experts in foreign policy in the United States, I think it's fair to say, and you certainly have a real background in the Middle East, among other places. Can you just summarize in 5 minutes what's going to happen in the Middle East, Ukraine, and Taiwan, China? Can you just give us a kind of a little overview of what we can expect over the next month or two?
I will, but I also want to answer the first of these questions here before we're done. On that, look, partially it connects to this, that there's a relationship to everything you and I have been talking about and the questions you just asked. And we saw it with the aid bill. American political dysfunction and so forth makes it very hard for us to act in the world, to generate the resources and the policies. And you mentioned before your question about the quality of our democracy, and that's not necessarily much of a model anymore. So I think there's a connection in all three. We've introduced, because of our politics, a degree of uncertainty into our predictability and reliability. So I think our allies are slightly unnerved by it. I travel a lot, as do you. Every friend of ours is worried about the uncertainty in the future. We used to have elections as frequently as we have them now, but there was a presumption of more continuity than discontinuity. I think the rest of the world no longer has that presumption. And that's a real difference. So in Asia, what we now call the Indo-Pacific, I think the two parties are both very tough on China, but real questions about our willingness to stand by our allies in South Korea, Japan, and about what we would do about Taiwan. I think there's uncertainty there. I think in terms of Europe, for now, we've settled the aid bill. I think there's questions about U.S. policy towards Ukraine and Russia after the election. The strength of our alliances. The big difference, I think, between the Trump and the Biden foreign policies is Trump was America first, Biden is alliance first. A big difference in those emphases. Middle East, I mean, we get involved in it. I'm just trying to think, I think certain differences about how much emphasis to place on the Palestinian issue, how much of a free hand to give to Israel, how confrontational with Iran. I think rhetorically the administrations are very different. In actual policy, not as different as some people would like them to be. I think there's the rhetoric of the Biden administration has been more critical of Israel, but some of the willingness to translate some of the rhetoric into policy has not been pronounced. Should I tell you the question?
Go ahead.
Looking ahead, what are the key challenges and opportunities you foresee for businesses aiming to play a larger role in civic education? I was going to broaden it, which is what businesses could do. Let me just put a few things out there, and I'd be curious your reaction. One is make it really easy for their people to vote. So whatever it is to have your workforce vote on is one thing. Second of all, to think about educational opportunities. What can you bring into your business about the issues in a way that would be, you have all these employee resource groups on DEI and others. So why can't there be employee resource groups on democracy? Why is that an untouchable subject? Something universities do, David. You've been chair of the board of several universities. So for tenured professors, we'll give them 2 years to go into government, and then that slot still waits for them when they come in. Why can't more businesses do that? I don't mean mom and pop stores, but large businesses that have tens of thousands of people in their workforce. Why can't they create arrangements where somebody wants to go off and work for a year or two in, Department of Homeland Security, Department of whatever, state, federal, city government, they do it. And they come back and they have a job. And ideally, they'll be more valuable when they come back. They would have had this really good experience. So that ought to be something we do. And then I think most controversial, I don't think anything I said is wildly controversial, I think businesses ought to think twice before they support candidates or parties or causes that are detrimental to democracy. I believe businesses have an enormous stake in the health of American democracy, so they ought to think twice before they contribute money to individuals or spend money on platforms through advertising that undermine American democracy. I just think that they've got to think about what's in their own self-interest.
Okay. So what do you think about the idea that you can't get a driver's license until you can pass a civic education test? Some states are talking about that. Maybe one or two have done it.
Well, I mean, it's probably not a correlation or connection I would make. I would love, look, I think the answer is to have good civics education. And that's something we can do. I mean, look, you know, you look at how immigrants to this country who want to become citizens, the tests they've got to take. It's not, shall we say, wildly demanding, yet a very low percentage of American citizens could pass that test. And I think the answer then is, you know, I wouldn't necessarily say it's a way to, we should use it to keep people off the roads. People have lots of reasons to get on the roads, to drive, to get to work, other things. So I wouldn't make it a kind of punitive thing. I would think we need to make civics positive and available. And we ought to build it into schools. We ought to build it, you know, for young kids, elementary school, middle school, high school, college. Again, my goal is no one can get a degree in this country without having had exposure to civics. We don't let kids graduate from school unable to read and write. Why do we think it's okay that they graduate from school and are not prepared to be citizens? Why is that not a requirement or a priority? We can then have the conversation about what ought to be the content of that education. That's a fair conversation. Bring it on, as we say. I'd love to have that conversation. But I think that's got to be a national commitment. I think it's outrageous that you can go to 99% of our colleges and universities, and you can navigate your course requirements in such a way you can be functionally illiterate about what it means to be an American citizen. That's outrageous.
Well, you can graduate from almost any college in the United States without having to take an American history course.
100%.
You can be a history major at most colleges and still not take an American history course. So American history is not exactly a subject that people are signing up for. As much as you might think.
No, and that's why I'm a great believer in a core curriculum, and that we've got to say as a society, this matters, this is important. Now, that's not the end of the conversation, because again, I was online this week, we were talking about it, and I looked at what Columbia was requiring in its civics course, and let me just sort of say, the selection of readings did not fill me with confidence and warmth. It was, shall we say, a highly it would not have been a set of readings that I would have chosen. I thought it was, you know, kind of the woke, to use an awful overused word, but it had gotten so politicized, and both what they were being asked to read and what they were not being asked to read. So again, I think there's a question of how do you come together to build a consensus about what young people ought to have at various stages of life? How do you teachers, and how do we train the teachers? I mean, there's a real crisis in this country, I would argue, in teacher education. So this is a complicated thing. Yes, but I think it begins, though, with a sense of this is important. Then we can figure out, if you will, how do we implement it at the various levels and so forth. But at first, we've got to have a collective recognition that this matters.
So the most famous graduate, perhaps, of Columbia was Alexander Hamilton. He wrote the Federalist Papers with a few others. You have to read that to graduate from Columbia? Probably not.
I think it's on, I can't remember. No, I don't, I could be wrong, I don't want to misspeak. I think the fall list, it may have been on, but I would say, look, the idea that you would have to read elements, some of the Federalist Papers, the Constitution, maybe the Articles, maybe, to sort of understand some Supreme Court decisions, Brown versus Board, and so forth. I don't think that's asking too much of our students or faculty. So I'm just curious, what's more important than that? I'm just curious, like if you're running a university or a school, what do you think, to the extent that there's opportunity cost and trade-offs, I'm curious, what do you think is more important than that? That's a fair conversation to have.
I think, let me just tell one story, if I could, at the end about American history, the importance of it, and that sometimes people don't feel a need to learn it as much. There was a young man who was a student at Harvard College, and he wanted to major in American history. And his father said to him, don't major in American history. You'll never get a job. You won't make any money. You'll starve to death as an American history professor. And he said, Dad, this is what I really want to do. And he said, well, okay, you're not going to get anywhere in life. And so the student went to Harvard, and he majored in American history. He came back from spring break one day, got off in the airport at Logan Airport, and got into a cab and said to the cab driver, please take me to Cambridge. And the cab driver said, are you a student at Harvard? Yes, I am. What are you majoring in? I'm majoring in American history. Cab driver said, well, when I was a student at Harvard, that's what I majored in also. That person was John Roberts, and the Chief Justice of the United States, and he switched to, I guess, pre-law, and he went to law school. But his father had convinced him that maybe he should do it earlier, but I think it was the cab driver that convinced him to maybe do something else. So did you ever think about majoring in American history?
I thought you were asking me if I ever think of becoming a cab driver. Well, I did my undergraduate in Middle Eastern studies, and then I did grad. I wish I'd done more, and I actually did most of my history in international when I was at Oxford. No, it was writing these books that I actually had the education on American history only recently. And it was normally when you write a book, you know something about it before you write it. This was the first book I've ever written where I actually I knew it was important, but I also knew how little I knew. So it became a self-education process. So I actually finally studied the American history I never studied.
So we're about out of time, so let me ask you the question you probably get asked a lot, which is, are you optimistic about the country's future, despite all the things you've said, or are you pessimistic about the country's future?
I would say I'm worried about the country's future. And so I don't know how to balance the optimism, but I'm worried. And so my takeaway is not to give up, but also not to be sanguine. I actually feel a sense of urgency that we're living in a moment where a lot of history is at stake in the world and in the country. Not a lot is on a glide path. So I actually, look, you've been in government, I've been in government, you've had this extraordinary career in business and finance. There's not a lot that's baked into the cake. There's so much that could go differently. So what I want to do is I want to impart a sense of urgency and involvement. So I want to, and look, we look at, coming back to the subject today, the last couple elections, tiny numbers of Americans in a couple of states have had outsized impact. So out of the 160 million votes, or whatever the number is going to be cast this November, probably less than 1 million, probably less than 500,000 distributed in a couple of states will be decisive. So what my view is, it's not pessimism or optimism. I want more people to get informed and get involved. And that's my view. So if more people get informed and get involved, then I think I will end up being quite optimistic.
All right, well, thank you, Richard. We are out of our allotted time, so I want to thank you for a good conversation, and thank you all for being here.
I want to thank David, not just for the conversations and that, but also that he's a perfect example of a citizen who's really done a lot to tee up these issues and give them visibility. And it just shows you can really make a difference in American society. You don't have to enjoy formal positions of power in government. Citizens can make a real difference, and Citizen Rubenstein has done that.
Want to make the world safe for baseball.
The Baltimore Orioles, yes.
Right. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. See you.
Yeah, should we start? Great. All right, welcome back. That was a terrific way to get us started. I hope it was provocative for you guys, and we'll pick up on some of those issues as we carry on this conversation. We've got a wonderful group here to, as I said, bring to this conversation some very practical insights from folks who are in the business community and out there every day trying to think carefully and carry out the role of business in sustaining our democracy. We have here with us today Louis Lozada, who is the CEO of Democracy Works. Democracy Works does some terrific work on helping educate Americans around the issues with regard to voting, but also was a co-founder with CAA Foundation of the Civic Alliance, with whom we have worked closely over the years. They've been a great partner, and we will hear about the work that they're doing. Hillary Crow, who is here from the U.S. Chamber, where she is Vice President of Civics at the U.S. Chamber Foundation. And Hillary, too, has been a part of so many of our efforts here in our conversations, and we really valued your input. Dave, is it Leichman? Leichman, Director of Corporate Civic Responsibility from Microsoft. And Microsoft has been a strong supporter of our Civics at Work initiative from day one. In fact, Brad Smith, the president of Microsoft, was the first business leader to sign up for that Civics at Work initiative. And Janice Brunner, who is here, Group General Counsel and Head of Civic Engagement at Travelers, which is one of the companies that has boldly stepped out to undertake this kind of work. And so we're very much looking forward to hearing about the work that that you do as well. And we're going to have an opportunity to hear about the specifics of what they're undertaking. But I really thought we maybe could start with a discussion about why each of you and your entities decided that sustaining our democracy, and specifically by helping to provide us with a more informed and engaged citizenry, was so important. That as individuals, you were passionate about it and you wanted to be engaged in it. As entities, you were willing to, of all the things that you could do out there, choose this as one of your priorities. And so, Louis, let's start with you and talk about both Democracy Works and the Civic Alliance.
Sure, and thank you for having us here. So Democracy Works, at its essence, it's about civic education and civic engagement. We focus on the when to vote, where to vote, and how to vote information that, unfortunately, in the United States is so requisite because, as we've heard from the stage already, voting can be complicated in this country relative to other countries. So just critical information on registration, where your polling location is, the sorts of ABCs of voting that get people from idea in their living room to, pulling a lever or bubbling in or whatever method of voting is in your particular jurisdiction. And our tie-in to the business community, which is what we really want to talk about today, started in 2015, 2016. We started doing these things called Turbo Vote corporate challenges. We have a voter registration, voter information platform called Turbo Vote. And we started partnering with companies such as Starbucks, Salesforce, American Airlines, to try to get their employees participating in voter registration drives, and consequentially, even those respective companies' customers. Because what we identified is, plucky nonprofit, you're only going to be able to reach so many people. But when you start partnering with big companies and big brands, that allows you to scale up in the distribution of this critical information. So you fast forward to 2020, companies were really, really interested in that election. And we had some experience with working with companies, and we really wanted to broaden the amount of impact that they could have with their employees and their customers. And that's when we came together with the CAA Foundation, that's Creative Artists Agency, their charitable arm, to develop the Civic Alliance. And it really was about getting companies to make meaningful commitments in support of democracy in the United States. And what do those meaningful commitments look like? Dr. Haas talked earlier about making it easier for people to vote. Well, we're helping companies develop paid time off to vote policies, paid time off to serve as a poll worker policies, voter registration drives within your company, and also out amongst your customers. We understand that some companies in the United States have significant real estate footprints, and understanding the sort of polling location deserts that exist in parts of the country where people have to wait online for 3 or 4 hours or drive great distances to get to a polling location. Well, if you've got space as a company, you have the infrastructure, you can use that real estate space, host a polling location. It's about creating spaces at companies where you can come together and talk about civics. You know, we've had a lot of conversation already today about how civic education has been hollowed out in the K through 12 level. But when you're in that corporate, that employer-employee context, you're already doing DEI, you're already doing ERG, why not add another class to the curriculum? And it's just the baseline, nonpartisan principles of how to be a citizen and how to support democracy. So we've had significant success. We have over 1,300 member companies, 2 of whom are represented on the stage here, Travelers and Microsoft. They represent 5.8 million employees in the United States, and their products and services are consumed by virtually every voter in the country. So it's really about supporting companies, nonpartisan, civic activities that they can put into their organizations that align with their brand and also meet the company at their size and their capability. Because what's going to work for a Microsoft, a Travelers, a Salesforce is not going to work for a Bad Robot or a Tony's Chocolonely. And we work with organizations from the biggest to 200 or 300 employees. So that's a little bit about Civic Alliance.
Yeah, outstanding. That's great. And as you said, Microsoft is one of those companies with whom you work. And Dave, Microsoft has really been forward-leaning on the democracy front. And tell us a little bit about how that came about. I mean,
Sure.
what was it that made the folks at Microsoft say, we've got some real concerns here? What were those concerns? And we think we can help address it.
Well, as you said, our president, Brad Smith, has always been very forward on these issues, and I credit him for a lot of the framing and our ability to do these great projects and this great work. Look, I'm going to steal a line from you, if that's okay. You're fond of saying that democracy is good for business, so business has to be good for democracy, right? That's foundational to our work. We really take that to heart. I mean, we talk about how democracy is the underpinnings of capitalism, at least in the United States, and whether you think that's fair or right or not, that is how our system is structured. Capitalism and democracy go hand in hand. And that's partly because the rule of law is known, right? We know the regulatory environment. Democracy allows freedom of ideas to flourish, things like that, right? And so our business, fundamental ability to make money as a business, is dependent on American democracy. Something like 95+% of our revenue comes from democratic countries. That shouldn't be a surprise, right? Like I always use the example, when the invasion happened in Ukraine, some of the tech companies got sideways with Russia, and Russia kicked Google out of Moscow, out of their office in Moscow. I know that Microsoft cannot be kicked out of Washington, D.C., because we have the rule of law here. We have a functional democracy. And so it's just absolutely critical that we invest resources in protecting and upholding that. The work we do in civics, I think, is one of the most important. I say that as the one who runs it, but we were one of the original companies in the TurboVote Challenge back in 2015, and I think you undersold it a little bit. I mean, there were, 10 of us in the original TurboVote Challenge, and now there's over 1,300 companies in the Civic Alliance. That's amazing. The ability of the Democracy Works to attract companies into this work, I think, has been really influential in the space.
Yeah. And so Dave, in addition to thinking about the things that you could do from a positive perspective, was there a discussion about the concerns driving this, that you looked around and saw something that you felt, all right, this is not a good place for us to be, and that's why we need to step in and address this?
Yeah, I think we've seen a lot of political acrimony around even civics in, especially in the 2016 and 2020 elections. And I appreciate the leadership of Microsoft and their ability to plant a flag and say, that's not okay. I don't remember who I was talking to walking up the stairs to this. I said that exact thing. I said, if you concede, you and I were talking about it. I said, if you concede that civics is partisan, you've lost democracy, right? And so our higher-ups have taken that to heart, right? It is necessary and proper that we do this work, and it can't be viewed as partisan. It has to be nonpartisan.
Yeah, well said. Janice, having said that, doesn't remove the challenges for businesses as they try to navigate in this just really highly charged and polarized environment that we're operating in today. And something as motherhood and apple pie, if I could say that, as understanding the nuts and bolts of our democracy should be an easy win. And yet I'm sure that travelers, as they thought about going at this in a big way, thought this through carefully. So share with us a little bit of both the, again, sort of the what did the leadership at Travelers see going on in the country that concerned them enough that they said, we really have to do this, and we're going to take some risk, but we're going to think it through, and here's how we're going to do it.
Sure. So I think you've hit on it right away, that part of what motivated us at Travelers was this idea that as an over 165-year-old company, we have really benefited throughout that period from the rule of law, a sound economic system, the ability to make investment in our business and our communities, because those communities are stable and governed by the democratic system that we are so fortunate to be a part of. And so I think that was a big part of it, as well as this idea of this rising polarization within the country and the risk that creates for business. So it's a risk externally in our communities, and it's also a risk internally within our corporation. I mean, we like to say at Travelers that one of the things that we do really well is that we come together as a team every day to solve problems, and we have people spread throughout the country with diverse perspectives and experiences and backgrounds, and everybody comes together and solves problems to do the best for our customers and our business. And so this idea that that's what we're doing really well at Travelers, if we can take that out into our communities as well, then we can really lead. And I think that's ultimately what civics education and civic engagement does, is it says, I want to be informed as a citizen, and I also want to take that out into my community and be an example. And I think one of the things that's been really successful about our program, in addition to encouraging people to be more informed about our system of government, as well as being more engaged, is this idea that in addition to voting, in addition to being educated about our system, is also to be a part of it through maybe serving in a local office. So one of the things that we've done is we've really spotlighted employees who are engaged in a civic way, whether it's on their town council or their school board, or and how important that is, at the local level, to kind of get people out and to kind of be working within their communities and kind of learn different perspectives that way.
Yeah, that community level focus, I think it can be really important. Hillary, the Chamber started this civic forward emphasis some years ago, and I have to say, when I started hearing accusations that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce was too woke, I realized we had entered a whole new realm here. But even the Chamber, there must have been conversations around, should we be doing this? This is a little bit risky. If you can, share with us a little bit about the, kind of the thinking, and again, what drove you at the foundation with the support of the Chamber to say, we think this is really important and we're going to go forward. And then we'll come back in a little bit to hear the details about what you're doing. But,
sure,
yeah.
Absolutely. Yes, I started at the foundation over 14 years ago, and if you would have told me then that the Chamber would be accused now of being woke, I'm not sure I would have believed it. So we really started focusing on civics back in around 2018. As you mentioned before, the Democracy Forward, we started looking at what were the potential threats of the future to America's long-term prosperity. And so we were looking at some of the trends of increasing levels of polarization, declining support for democracy, what looked like increasing support for socialism. And what we found was it was really tied to a multi-generational crisis in civic knowledge. People really don't understand how our political system is supposed to work, let alone how our economic system is supposed to work. As Dave mentioned, here in America, those systems really heavily rely on each other. The success of one depends on the success of the other. And so we started to dig in, and we partnered with the Harvard Business Review at the time and produced a white paper making the business case for civics. And as has already been talked about today, the business community as a whole had been really absent from the conversation of civics. And we're seeing companies like Travelers and Microsoft and others really taking those steps forward and doing something about it. And as a result of our research and the work that we've done, we launched a few years ago the Civic Trust, which is a program of the foundation. And our goal is really about increasing civic knowledge across America and educating Americans about the important relationship between our economic and political systems. And so we have 3 pillars of the trust that include civic literacy, civics at work, and elevating civics as a national priority, because we know that we can't just focus on civics education for young people and just wait 40 years for them to be professionals or have different roles in their careers and make a difference. We also have to address those knowledge gaps in adults as well. And so we're really focused on how we can harness the power of business, which is our mission at the foundation, to develop and deploy solutions for the good of this country. And we're really excited about the work that we're doing, and I'll dive more into that in a few minutes. But yes, we hear from companies all the time, state and local chambers all across the country, employers of all sizes, about the concerns and the worries, and we remain optimistic, right? Despite the statistics of not only about 80% of 8th graders fail a civics quiz, according to some recent civic literacy studies that we've done, about 70% of adults also fail a basic civics quiz, right? More than half of adults can't name the 3 branches of government. 26% can't name a single right protected by the First Amendment. These are significant challenges, right? We can't begin to address the problems and the challenges before us if we aren't starting with a place of knowledge and understanding both our rights and responsibilities, as Richard mentioned earlier, as citizens. And so we're creating ways for employers to take some small steps, and Travelers and Microsoft have both done a really great job of this, of starting to have those conversations around civics and knowledge and engagement that can have a real impact. And we know that the security and prosperity of our country depends on the strength of our democracy. So even though that word democracy has even become politicized lately, we have to stand behind it and we have to protect it. And the time for employers to get involved is now, and we can't wait any longer.
Well said. And that chamber did a terrific study a few years ago on the business case for democracy and for civics. So let's get into some of the details about what you guys are doing, Janice, at Travelers, and give us a sense of, I know this is relatively new for Travelers, so you'll have more sort of data for us, presumably, but how is it going so far? How is it being received? What are you doing, and then how is it being received by your workforce?
Sure. So we started, we call our civic engagement program Citizen Travelers, and we started Citizen Travelers fall of 2021. So we have a little bit of experience under our belt, and I think when we started it, we thought it was just at a time, I think there was just a feeling of a lot of discomfort. A lot of people were feeling just kind of pulled in a bunch of different directions. And when we started it, we kind of thought, let's be very careful because we want to make sure, one of our overarching principles is that we say we are aggressively nonpartisan. And we wanted to make sure that we were very clear about that and that we could run a program that would be aggressively nonpartisan, because the idea really was going back to this idea that we have employees, customers, communities, we're in communities throughout the country with all sorts of different perspectives and ideas, and we really wanted to, we felt like in order to be successful, we could not be political. We had to be open to engaging by all, and this idea that there had to be a certain amount of trust, that we weren't trying to tell people how to vote or what to think, but rather what we were saying is, whatever you care about, whatever you're passionate about, get involved. That's the beauty of this country, is that whatever is your issue, you should get involved in your own right. So, and I think that the nice part about that also is it in a way, it takes it out of the corporation in the sense of, we have core business issues that we engage on as a business, but we can't engage on every political issue we just can't, because we do have customers and employees spread throughout the country. So we can't weigh in on every issue, nor is that our business kind of mission. But what we can say to our employees are, if these things are really important to you, you should engage in your own right. And I think that's the message of Citizen Travelers, is that we'll give you tools and resources for you to go, for you to, to tell you how and where to vote. We'll tell you, we'll support our employees that are engaged in their communities and local offices and things, but we're not, that's your choice, and what we're just saying, we're supporting you, we're giving you resources to do that. And I think that that's been very well received. I think we've been very pleasantly surprised by how much employees have embraced Citizen Travelers, and also how it has not been controversial. And every time I say that, I kind of knock on wood a little bit. So, but it really has been, and we've been very careful to do it in a way that is non-political, and to test people, to say like, hey, how is this coming across? What do you think about this? What would you like to see more of? And that really has been this conscious decision to say, we want this to be helpful, but we don't want it to be something that employees feel burdened by. It's really, if you want to engage, there are resources here for you to do that. It's in no way are we telling you what to do or how to engage. So it's been very well received. I think we've had a lot of positive response for employees. And just to go back to your question about what exactly we're doing, we have 3 pillars: learn, engage, and lead. And so learn is resources. For example, we partner with different nonprofits to provide resources. The Chamber, we're partnering with them on their civic that are different resources to provide more civic education. We partner with a bunch of different nonprofits we have like a program with Civics for employees and their kids to learn more about civics during their summer break, things of that nature. So and then the voting is part of that pillar also. And then engage is really kind of get out into your community. And what we've done in that regard is we've really kind of spotlighted certain employees who are civically engaged, whether it's on their town council or their economic division or something of that nature. And we've highlighted employees that are engaged, and we've let other employees see how did they do it? Why are they involved? How did they get involved? And we put them all in touch with each other through this community. And so people who are interested in getting engaged have a model from other employees, and they also have kind of like a group to talk to each other about. So I'm on the town council in Connecticut. I'm talking to someone in New Mexico about how they're engaged, and we have the same issue. We had someone who was in a volunteer fire commissioner, and they were talking to someone throughout the country about a grant they got so that they could access new uniforms and things of that nature. So it kind of just, it's like, it's a way to put employees who are engaged in a positive way in their communities in touch with each other, to kind of learn from each other and feel connected. And then lead. I think the other thing that we've learned is that by doing this, people see the positive experience and they can actually are inspired. So I've been so inspired by the employees within Travelers that are engaged civically. It's really hard to sit on your couch if you can see someone else that's out there. Like we have one person in our IT department. He's the volunteer fire commissioner, running the fire commission for his town, and he's out there like fighting fires at 2 a.m. in the morning sometimes. So when I see him and how much he's engaged in his community in that way, I think, okay, maybe I could do a little bit more also. So it's been kind of this, I think we have a lot going on as far as different kind of initiatives and different activities, but it's kind of this idea that there's something for everyone. And through this work, I think you're also getting to know a lot of different people and learning a lot of different perspectives and experiences, which I think also goes back to this idea of you're learning things in your community that you can bring back to travelers. You're learning things at travelers that you can bring out to your community. And you're also kind of, this polarization kind of breaks away when you're actually working with a lot of different people.
Yeah. And I'm sure that some of that networking that happens is happening between people who might not otherwise talk to each other and who may have different political views, et cetera, but they've got, as we know, sometimes all it takes is one thing in common.
Exactly.
To begin to have a discussion. So and the power of positive stories, I think, is really, really important, and it's one of the reasons that I asked the four of you to be here today, to help share these positive stories, because we do hear so much about the concerns about our democracy, and it's so important to hear about the great work that's being done. So thank you to Travelers for that. Were you able to find resources? I mean, was what you put together for your employees did you have to create all of that within in-house, or were you able to reach out to groups like iCivics, Civic Renewal Network, and others to pull in resources? Businesses who are maybe inspired by this story are thinking, how hard is this?
Sure. So I really attribute our success to the influence of our CEO, Alan Schnitzer, who said, this is important to me. And this was really his brainchild. And so him saying, this is something that we're going to support as a company, I think has made a huge impact, because that really drove the support throughout the organization, and it got everyone's attention. And one of the things that we did early on was we said, we're not a civics, we're a business, ultimately, as we've been all talking about the business case. We answer to our shareholders. And so we're not going to become kind of a civics organization. We're not going to be writing up, information about, our democracy. That's not our mission. But what it is we're going to reach out to all the entities that are already doing that. And so we have had amazing partners. The Civic Trust at the Chamber is one of several, and that we've basically just tapped into those organizations and said, can we put our employees in touch with you, either for information, for opportunities? We have certain volunteer opportunities. We have a Get Out the Vote portal on our intranet. All of those things. I think there's a ton of resources out there. And we actually have what we call, we've put together a playbook that kind of just describes our program in more detail, and we'd be happy to share with anyone who's interested, that kind of goes through some of those organizations and activities. And it's also, we have a website as well, so Suzanne can easily provide that information. But what we've said is it doesn't have to be expensive. It's really, actually, there's a lot of resources out there, and that it's really just tapping into them. And it's scalable. Companies big and small can do it. It's just a matter of tapping into the resources that are out there.
It's so great. And we at the Defending Democratic Institutions Project did a guide for businesses that want to implement civics at work with a list of resources. And we will include the playbook, which Travelers is so gracious to make available to everyone so that folks have that resource available. Dave, she talked about the importance of that message from the very top, right? And how important that is. It's one of the reasons we target business leaders when we, try to get businesses to engage here. You mentioned that, Brad Smith, of course, just made this a priority and said this is going to be important. And you've actually, the company did some reorganization to make sure there was an institutional home for this effort. Tell us a bit about how Microsoft went about this and how successful you feel you've been, and kind of what are your metrics?
It's been interesting, the history of this at the company, because Democracy Works knows up until about 2020 we were, let's say, rogue, guerrilla operation internally. We have a group called the Civic Engagement Volunteer Team, which now is official, and I'm the executive sponsor. But 5 years ago, we were hustling. We were hustling internally to do what we could.
So sometimes you can do a bottoms-up approach.
Sometimes you can, but I mean, I'll be totally honest. January 6th changed all of that, right? I think for everybody, we ended up writing. We used to be called the Defending Democracy team, and after January 6th, we wrote a memo up to Brad and said, hey, we have to be doing more. And I think you often highlight that as this is what happens when people don't know how their own government works. They act in stupid ways. And we can't afford things like that. We can't afford it as a society, as a business community. We can't afford that. And so he actually officially blessed civic engagement as part of our work. And since then, I really appreciate, I don't even have to say anything about what we do because you said it all already. We do all exactly that.
It's a good template.
Yeah, it is fantastic.
Yeah.
And Democracy Works has been instrumental in providing templates like that to some of these companies. Sorry, I told you.
No, I love
talk
it.
you up the whole time. One of the things we have internally is called the Civic Engagement Hub. Very, very similar, where we provide actually the same exact three resource framing. We're all about resourcing employees, and I love that you called it aggressively nonpartisan. I call it defensively nonpartisan internally because I guess I'm more worried about litigation. But I do get hate mail from employees, and that's okay. I want everybody to bring their authentic selves to work. I wish their authentic self was maybe different, but it's okay for them to not like
civil,
it.
maybe. Yeah,
at least civil. But when we look at the partnerships we create for employees, we try and I say defensively nonpartisan because we work with organizations like Vote Riders is the archetype I like to hold up. Vote Riders helps, if you don't know, get ID for people who don't have voter ID in states where they need it. Georgia is a perfect example. Georgia put into laws in place where you basically have to have your birth certificate to register to vote. And I bet half the people in this room don't know where their birth certificate is, right? And so it costs $50 in Georgia to get a birth certificate, even if you are entitled to one. And that's hard for a lot of people. And so an organization like Vote Riders just helps. They just help. If you're a liberal and you hate voter ID, fine. They're helping people get voter IDs. If you're conservative and you love voter IDs, great. They're helping people get voter IDs, right? It should be a nonpartisan thing. And so we've actually engaged this year in a brand new, so we've done all of these things and we're like, okay, where do we go next? I think the best part of my job is actually exactly what you said, highlighting positive stories. We call it Profiles in Public Service on our Civic Engagement Hub, and we have a bunch of elected officials who are at Microsoft. We even have a state legislator in Washington State. But we do roundtables with them all the time. We highlight their stories, poll workers, people who serve on boards and commissions, things like that. But we're like, okay, where do we go next with all of this? And so this year, we partnered with all of the we have the employee resource groups have what we call the Big Nine, and they're exactly what you think, right? Gleam, gays and lesbians at Microsoft, or BAM, blacks at Microsoft, right? Just about every employee at Microsoft is a member of one of these, the Big Nine ERGs.
At least one.
At least one. Yeah. Yes, I'm in several. And so we've created partnerships this year for all of the Big Nine that are volunteer opportunities. Microsoft has an incredibly generous matching program for donations, but also for volunteering. And people have been coming and saying, it's 2024, I want to do something. So I'm trying to give them an answer to what does that mean? What does it mean to do something this year? So BAM is partnered with Vote Riders. Our Families ERG, to talk them up a little bit, is partnered with iCivics. Very similar to what you've laid out. Our Women at Microsoft Vote is partnered with League of Women Voters. It's obvious partnerships, but we're trying to create tangible volunteer opportunities so the employees can say, I want to do something this year. And we're like, great, here's a nonpartisan civic engagement opportunity for you to take up.
Yeah, great. And one of the things that I think is so interesting about doing this work at Microsoft, and it's something that when I had the opportunity to do the fireside chat with Brad Smith, that he and I talked about is how important this is across the board, but particularly in the tech sector. There's a real need, I think, for that cross-disciplinary approach. You've got a lot of technically oriented people coming in to work at Microsoft, not the poli-sci social studies students who probably, ate up their civics class in school and loved it. These are students for whom that was maybe not their first passion and love. And yet, we need our innovators, we need our tech sector to have that sense of civic responsibility, that sense of how policy is made and how government works, just like with everybody else. So I've been particularly appreciative of the emphasis there.
I'll tell you, there's two sides to that coin. One is the sheer size of the employee base. You said the Civic Alliance currently represents, what is
5.8 million.
5.8 million? A million of those are Amazon, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You could chunk it up that way.
A quarter of a million are Microsoft. A quarter of a million are right? I mean, we are giant companies. Right. So the employee base alone Microsoft is the size of a small city. So working on civics education should be a no-brainer, right? But we also have reach. The TurboVote Challenge actually started because Starbucks wanted to put voter registration links on the sleeves for the coffee cups. Brilliant, right? The reach. Who hasn't seen a Starbucks coffee cup in the last week? So seeing that, being able to quickly jump to voter registration, the reach we have as in the tech sector is insane. Amazon's reach, Microsoft's reach, Apple's reach. We can do big things if we take our external presence and put it towards something like just resourcing voter registration.
Yeah, and doing this at scale is something we've talked about, right? So that really helps. But Hillary, most Americans don't work for these huge companies, right? Most Americans work for small and medium-sized businesses.
That's right.
And it's one of the reasons that I love working with the chamber, because you've got your local chambers all across the country, and you have that ability to reach those small and medium-sized employers and businesses and be a presence in those communities. So talk to us about how you take advantage of that and some of the creative things that you've been doing over at the chamber.
Sure, yes, happy to. And I think this conversation just really underscores why civics at work can be so effective, right? When you have 160 million Americans that are in the workforce, when you are tapping and connecting with employers, you can reach 160 million Americans. And so there's a huge opportunity for employers as the most trusted institution still existing in America, as a place where people still have to come together who have, right, we sort of self-select the communities where we live or where our kids go to school or places of worship or even where we grocery shop. But the workplace is still one of those places where we still have to come together with people who have different backgrounds and ideologies and belief systems and have to work together toward a common shared purpose and shared goal. And so there's so many reasons, as well as Janice talked a little bit earlier about the link between civic skills and workplace skills, and how when you develop those leadership skills in the workplace, then people can go out into their communities and use those skills, or they develop the skills in the communities through civic engagement and they can bring those back to the workplace. So there's just this virtuous cycle that can be created. And the network of state and local chambers that we have access to at the U.S. Chamber Foundation and through the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is phenomenal. We know that trust at the local level is so much higher than at the national level, right? People trust the people that they know in their communities, in their states, and having those leaders at the local level across states just gives you, one, trust that you can't push out from a national level organization, and two, the ability to scale and grow things pretty quickly. And so our most significant project to date under the Civic Trust is the National Civics Bee. We're talking about work right now, but I have to mention that we launched 2 years ago a nationwide competition for middle school students focused on civics. And our goal is to increase civic knowledge, as I mentioned earlier. And through this competition that happens at a local level, then local finalists move to a state competition, and we're hosting our first inaugural national round of the competition this November. We'd love for you all to come. we are not just connecting with middle school students, who most of them say they've never had civics in school before, but also their parents and also the business leaders and the elected officials and the educators in their communities. And we've seen, while we're not getting into the civics curriculum space, we've seen that this is creating public demand for civics that is supporting the policy efforts that the state chambers are taking. So we've seen Kentucky recently increase their standards around civic education, and they specifically cited participating in the National Civics Bee as something that has created this public demand in the state. We've heard the same in Iowa. We've heard from schools in Pennsylvania. So it's having that impact. And if it weren't for the partnerships with the local and state chambers, we wouldn't have gone from 5 cities 2 years ago to now 120 communities across 28 states, right? More than 20x growth in less than 2 years. And we're really delighted that Travelers is a national partner of the National Civics Bee this year, and they're going to host some National Civics Bee competitions for their own employees, so that brings civics back into the workplace and part of our conversation today. But we also, through our Civics at Work pillar, which I briefly mentioned earlier, are building projects and programs that give employers resources, as Dave was mentioning, to be able to share with employees, to say, if you're interested in, volunteering as a nonpartisan election poll worker, here's how you do it. This is where you can sign up to volunteer. By the way, there's shortages in 24 states right now, and 600 jurisdictions. So please volunteer to be an election poll worker. We're piloting a project in the next couple of months focused on juror education and why that's important and as a form of civic engagement. We are working through an idea on civics ed at work, and so more to come on that. But we see these state and local chambers as critical multipliers of all of this work, because it's a way to get it out to communities everywhere through trusted messengers with trusted messaging that can drive real impact through a grassroots way that has a national reach.
That's so amazing. I didn't realize you were already in 120 cities. That is really impressive, Hillary. Outstanding. And I love the sort of the way, the almost subversive way you're going to use the kids to get to the grown-ups, right?
It's part of a bigger serious strategy. People see these adorable young people, which is great. We care about them also, but it's an effective way to reach all of these other members of their communities.
Sure, you get the folks who are coming out in the audience to watch, and local newscasts that cover this competition. It's wonderful.
Absolutely.
I remember Stop, Drop, and Roll, right? That was a campaign that wasn't really geared toward kids. But it was given to kids, but the hope was the kids would go home and talk to their parents about it, so that their parents would actually, know what
Right.
to do. Right?
And we quiz the audience at the same time as the kids are taking the civics quiz on stage. And so, the parents get pretty put out that their 11-year-old is acing the quiz and they're, only got 20% of the questions right. So it's a lot of fun, and we seem to be really multi-generational, where it's the grandparents and the parents and the younger siblings are all there cheering their family member on. And so it's been really motivating and inspiring. There's hope for the future, I'm here to say confidently.
That's great. And we are competitive beings, I think. So that idea of competition, one of the things we've talked with companies about is having that trivia night with drinks and pizza, and get teams going competing against each other. We've been talking now about getting law firms, which are just a little competitive, right? To maybe get out there and compete with each other. Louis, your wonderful organization has been cited repeatedly here for the great resource that you offer, and so let's assume that we've inspired folks out there who are watching and listening to this. And they want to do something, and they reach out to Democracy Works and to Civic Alliance, and what are they going to find? What have you got there for them? What are you doing?
Well, I think the first thing is an assessment of where you are as a company. I think we have 2 examples here on the stage of companies that at the executive level. I mean, Alan, and you mentioned Brad, but it also seemed like it was a bit of a covert move to get to Brad. But you already had buy-in at the highest levels of the organization. That makes rollout a lot easier. You have corporate civic champions, and you're well on the way to creating a corporate civic culture. but not every organization is there. You'll have organizations of varying sizes, and you'll have people that are not yet in the C-suite that will want to understand, how do we get started? And that's one of the first things that we do. Who are the key players in your organization? Is it your marketing function because you want to communicate to your customers that you are a civically engaged company? Is it your civic affairs because of some business imperative? Is it your legal department? There are going to be champions within the organization that will help you identify to help carry the flag on this project, why your organization should buy into civics, should buy into democracy. So I think that's step one. It's just picking up a phone before we try to figure out whether you're going to do a voter registration drive, paid time off to vote, poll worker recruitment. What's the appetite at your organization, and how can we increase that appetite so that you're getting the work done with buy-in? Because it's not going to be fun or helpful if it's just one or two people in the corner, unless you have an advocate like Dave. But what I'm talking about is assessing the readiness of the company and then figuring out what aligns with your particular brand, your audience, and the resources that you can bring to bear. So I think that's step one, is doing that sort of assessment. And then from there, when we're talking about a group of 1,300 companies, provides air cover. Sometimes dancing in these waters, and I always make the distinction between politics and we'll call it civic/democracy. Two very different things. You can argue about issues, you can argue about candidates, all this other stuff. But when it comes to democracy and civics, it's pretty black and white. Like this, we know what we're talking about here. This is not partisan. Let's figure out what you can do in that space. How do we have conversations that are safe about this particular topic? And we'll help you figure that out at your organization. There are many resources out there. You got, the Chamber, you've got Civic Alliance, there are other organizing bodies of these companies. For my money, and obviously to pump our organization, it's 1,300 companies that are working on similar things. You're now doing knowledge sharing. So you have air cover, you have knowledge sharing. We have an advisory board that is really just made up of the member companies to try to figure out what is the best way to communicate if we're going to do it as a body? Because the Civic Alliance has made statements as a body. What are the topics that we should be educating our member companies on? So, for example, in early 2021, when you had a raft of legislation, Georgia, Arizona, a lot of things are popping up, and companies needed help explaining this to these groups within their company that wanted to learn about civics. So how do we explain the Georgia election law in a nonpartisan way? How do we explain the Arizona election? And those are the sorts of resources that we give you, because especially at the big companies, we know you've got systems already and you have resources and you develop your own civic hubs. But there are some things that you benefit from participating in larger groups from. And that's what we try to bring to bear to the situation.
Outstanding. Yeah, that's great. All right, well, we have provoked some questions from the audience, and if those of you who are online, there's a ask question button, so please feel free to send in your questions, and those of you who are in the room, you all have brochures, and there's a QR code, or you can use the one on the screen. But our first question is from Ben Spegan from the Jefferson, and I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name, from the Jefferson Educational Society. And it's something that we've certainly thought about here. He says, Hillary mentioned how even the word democracy has become problematic for some. And so the question is, how are we reclaiming it as a word, and then the idea, or leaning into using that word rather than finding alternative ways to convey democracy, using different terminology? And it's certainly something that we've thought about in the things that we've written and put up online, and curious how you all approach this. So it's one thing to talk about civics, it's another thing to talk about democracy today. So who wants to take a stab at that?
I can go first, just to say we really frame it as civics, right? Because that way you're reducing any perceived negative association with the word, and you're distancing it further from politics. Because, just over the last few years, that word democracy has been used by political parties with specific agendas. And so it's really hard to pull that out and to make people understand what you mean when you say democracy, unfortunately. But civics is pretty clear. I mean, we define civics as the knowledge, skills, and disposition that every person in this country needs to exercise their rights and fulfill their responsibilities as Americans. And we should all be able to get behind that regardless of party or partisanship.
When you're working in an international environment, I mean, our company is beholden to all of the same international norms that most countries are, right? And they'll yell at me, I don't remember the human rights, there's one of the fundamental human rights declarations from the UN. Democracy is, the right to self-determination is actually a fundamental human right. We take that, I mean, I think every company should take that to heart, but I like the way we frame it at Microsoft is democracy forward doesn't stand alone. We're part of what we call tech for fundamental rights. That's democracy, human rights, accessibility, broadband access, sustainable business practices. Like those things aren't just, like democracy doesn't stand alone, it is a fundamental human right.
We've got democracy in our name as an organization, Democracy Works, so we really can't run from it. I try to ignore the branding issue of this because this is really a branding issue. It's been branded by, a side of the aisle that wants to beat it up, and we're just not going to allow it to do it. So Democracy Works, what do? We are the infrastructure, the underpinnings of democracy. And what are those? Information for voters, information for citizens, citizen participation. You lean into it. And Democracy Forward is leaning into it. I mean, just lean into the concept of democracy. We know we live in a representative democracy. To try to say it's something else is really, quite frankly, a waste of time.
I think, it goes back to what I was saying when we started this initiative. We just wanted to be really careful. And we always kind of revert back to that. If sometimes when we're thinking about a new initiative, we're thinking about a new thing, I'll even check with a couple people that might view it differently and say, how does this come across to you? Does this seem political? Does this seem partisan? Does this seem, just to make sure we get like a gut check to make sure that it doesn't come across that way. And that we are kind of being straight down the middle. And I think that helps a lot and builds trust. And so I think it goes back to what we were saying. We should all feel like our system is, we should all invest in it.
Yeah. Well, it is such a shame, I think, that we have to talk about whether to use the word democracy when we talk about what it is that we are trying to sustain and what we value in our system. We ultimately concluded that, we're going to continue to talk about the fact that this is a democracy, but it is also a constitutional republic. It is a democratic republic. There are lots of ways in which you can talk about the system that we have, and all of them are accurate. So, I think there are ways to navigate this as well. And our sense, too, is that certainly at the workplace, the issues around civics are trickier, I think, in the K through 12 context, because you are with those students hopefully every day. You have the opportunity to impart a lot more information. And in that context, you really do need to bring in history.
Right.
And I find that it's really the history, how we tell our history, how we tell that story, that people have such strong and oftentimes differing views. As you say, the nuts and bolts of how our system works, that we have these three branches, this is how they're supposed to work, these are our aspirations for them, the federalist system. Here's what you can expect from your state and local, and here's what your role is and how you hold this system accountable and bring about change. That's pretty basic stuff, yeah. So we had a question here too about how the work that you're doing in businesses, the degree to which you partner with educational institutions, and particularly, we've talked about colleges and universities and even law schools, which we'll hear a little bit about on the next panel, that both can be resources, but also need to step up here and do a better job, by and large, in making sure that they are putting out students that are civic-minded and civically informed. So if any of you are doing any work with institutions of higher learning, or the questions suggested, nonprofits.
So we, at the, the Civic Trust, we have an advisory council that includes leaders from the Bill of Rights Institute, the National Constitution Center, iCivics, ASU, Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, and some others. So we are consistently checking in with these experts that are out in the field through nonprofit and through higher education on what we're doing and what we're building, getting their feedback and insight as we continue to grow our programs. And it's been really important and helpful to have their feedback and insight. They've been running some of these institutions for many decades and have a lot to share, and we really value their partnership.
I mean, the gang's all there.
Yeah,
You know, that
yeah,
those are all
yeah.
the experts,
Great.
and we really leverage all of them as well.
Yeah,
And
wonderful.
they're great institutions, very inspiring.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, speaking of inspiring, thank you, all of you, for helping us in our endeavor to inspire more companies to step up and engage here, both, you know, with your passion that you bring to this, but with that real practical help and advice that is really so important. And thank you for what you do every single day to help sustain our democracy. Really a joy to work with all of you, and thank you for being here. And please stick around, because in just 5 minutes, we're going to take the conversation into a particular focus on how incredibly important to our democracy is that understanding of and respect for the rule of law, which we see is really under fire these days, and is going to very likely play such an important role in the peaceful transition or retention of power in a few months' time. And what are the roles that the legal community can and is playing in helping to sustain our democracy. So we'll be back in just a couple of minutes. We're just going to swap out speakers. Thank you. Please join me in thanking our panel.
And then do you want to be in the middle? Don't you want to be in the middle? Okay. Yeah. This is much better because this way I don't have this shirt. I think that's
No, that's for Elizabeth. All right, I think we'll get started with our final panel. And I have the pleasure of introducing our moderator for the panel, my former boss at the Central Intelligence Agency and my lifelong mentor and dear friend, Elizabeth Rinskoff Parker. Elizabeth started her law career as a civil rights, a human rights lawyer, and went on to be the General Counsel for the National Security Agency, legal advisor for the State Department, and the General Counsel for CIA, which is where I had the great honor of working for her. So not the usual career path, I think, for folks in the national security community, but it served her very well. When she left government service, she went on to be the General Counsel for the University of Wisconsin system. She was later Dean of the McGeorge School of Law at the University of the Pacific. She became the CEO of the California Bar Association. In between, she's done various stints in private practice with law firms, some time at the FTC, a varied and very rich career and a clear dedication to public service. Elizabeth preceded me as chair of the American Bar Association's Standing Committee on Law and National Security. She was one of the founders of the area of national security law and making certain that that was brought into law schools so that our lawyers advising those encountering difficult issues of national security and law had the kind of training and underpinning that would serve our nation and preserve our democracy. So I can't think of anyone better than Elizabeth to moderate this panel. She has been a wise counsel, partner, collaborator, and worker bee on our civics project and our defending democratic institutions. So Elizabeth, thank you. I'll let you take it from there.
Suzanne, you are too gracious. I wish my mother were in the audience, but I think not. I have really a wonderful opportunity to begin a conversation with two women, also lawyers, who head really very, very important bar organizations. So I have to my immediate left Mary Smith, who is the head of the American Bar Association, and Jennifer Doan, who heads, or will shortly do so, ABOTA, the American Board of Trial Advocates. Now, these are very important. Perhaps together you may represent more lawyers than anybody else I know. They're different organizations, and I think each has come to the realization of the importance of civics in a different way. And as I begin to tease out some questions, I'm going to ask them to really speak personally, because I think one of the things I've learned, and by the way, in my introduction, you'll see there was not much about civics education. So how did I come to this particular position? And I think it really was listening and learning and realizing that perhaps what was going on in the world out there was not the same civics understanding that I had had many years ago in what was a very good education, but was unique. And I think we've all been surprised at how many of us assume things that once you hear about the facts are no longer true. The statistics of 22%, for example, of students being proficient in civic education is a real stunner. It was for me in any event. So let me just begin by saying that the surveys, of course, are replete with data. We really don't have to argue that there's a problem here. And if you haven't read Richard Haas's book, I would warmly recommend it. It's a lovely, brief, and very comprehensive and very readable explanation of what the problem is, the Bill of Obligations. He would say we have a crisis, and I, for one, would agree. There have been, as we've heard, many responses to this, although no regulatory response, either at the state or national level, for the K-12 population. But this is a problem that has a history that may go back to the early 60s. And so there are generations of adults who have suffered from a decline in civic education, and that decline has been accelerating as we go forward. So what I'm going to begin by asking the two leaders of bar organizations next to me and on the panel here is talk to us about what we do about this population who are no longer in K through 12 educational settings, who are adults who are really moving into leadership positions. And what can we as lawyers do? In fact, not only what can we do, but what must we do? Do we not have a role as what I've always said to my law school classes, the stewards of our legal system? So what's our responsibility as lawyers? And beyond that, what can we do to inspire our clients, or your clients, or lawyers' clients, to do more? So some questions to think about. What convinced you personally that we have a decline in civics and why that was a problem? And why is it important to lawyers? What about their clients? What role and responsibility should lawyers have? And are your members as aware of this as I believe the two of you clearly are? And finally, what kind of programs are you developing or have you developed? So Mary Smith, I want to begin with you. And I want you to say a little bit about your background, but you're the president of the American Bar Association, and you have a very diverse and interesting background yourself. You're a native of Chicago, but also from a diverse background, and you've had quite an involvement in affinity bars as well. So let me begin by saying, of course, this is a special day for you. We're lucky to have you here because tomorrow's Law Day. And I know that the ABA has for some years made Law Day really a signature event. So maybe you'd say a little bit about that as a starting proposition.
Well, thanks for having me here. It's wonderful to be here. Thanks to Suzanne for inviting me. Well, yeah, I just think there's probably no more important topic to talk about. And it really is fitting because tomorrow is May 1st, and that's Law Day. And in the 1950s, there were rise of autocracy as well and military parades. And one of my predecessors, ABA President Charles Rhine, in 1958 approached President Eisenhower, and as the counter to these military parades, we created May 1st as Law Day. And when he enacted it, President Eisenhower said, we no longer have a choice we must adhere to the rule of law. So tomorrow, we will be celebrating Law Day fittingly at the National Constitution Center, and the event will be live streamed, and it's kind of, I think, particularly poignant. One of President Eisenhower's ancestors, relatives, Judge Eisenhower, is going to talk about the beginning of Law Day.
And I think you've named this year's program as Voices of Democracy. And I'm kind of curious to know whether perhaps your involvement with affinity bar organizations informed that choice. Can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, when I was thinking about the ABA, one of the little secrets is the ABA president gets to pick the Law Day theme. And when I was thinking about it, to me, the essence of democracy is having diverse voices and having those voices have a seat at the table. And as you mentioned, I'm Native American, and previously I was president of the National Native American Bar Association, and I know, I'll just speak for the Native American community, but there's many communities where their voices have not been heard. We can think of, just using the Native American as an example, policies that have really harmed or massacred Native Americans, and I think one of the common threads of those policies is they did not have a voice at the table. So when I was picking the Law Day theme, I picked Voices of Democracy, and we actually did a pre-Law Day program, which we had not done before, where we asked the presidents of all the affinity bars, so the National Bar Association, which is the African American Bar, the National Asian Pacific Bar Association, the Hispanic Bar Association, the National Native American Bar Association, to film this little video about what does democracy mean to me and what can lawyers do, and it's on our website, and I've watched it several times because it's such a powerful video.
You know, this really, I think, goes back to a comment that Richard Haas made in the opening conversation. As I would put it, we have a culture that knits us together. We don't have ethnicity, we don't have race, we don't have gender that knits us together. It's this culture of democracy, and I think that might be what you're really inspired to demonstrate in Voices of America. Did I get that right?
No, I think you put it very eloquently.
Okay, well, it's a wonderful program, but it's not the only program.
No.
So the ABA, I have to say, I'm delighted to see, is really stepping up, and you've got a lot of things going on. Can you kind of quickly go through a couple of the others? I'm thinking of the your Task Force for American Democracy in particular.
Yeah. Well, one of the things you get to do when you're becoming a leader of an organization is plan where are you going to focus. And I gave this a lot of thought, and I kept coming back to, there is no more important issue facing all of us today than the threats to American democracy. So we've created a task force for American democracy, and I am thrilled that former Secretary of Homeland Security Jay Johnson and former federal judge J. Michael Ludick have agreed to be co-chairs. And when we reached out to them, they're very busy people, high demand. They didn't hesitate. In fact, Secretary Johnson said he thought, and this is a person who's been Secretary of Homeland Security, he's been the only general counsel position you didn't have, right. General counsel of Department of Defense.
Sure.
And he said that he thought there was no more honor in his life than to do this because it's so important. And I am proud to say that Richard Haas is also a member of the task force. He also did not hesitate. And the task force is focusing on three things. One is to ensure trust in our election systems. Two is to instill what we've been talking about all day today, which so many wonderful work's being done, but to instill civics in our culture, and then to recommend any improvements. And one of the things we've been doing, which we've kind of combined with a Law Day tomorrow as well, is we've been doing these listening tours around the country.
Can you say a little bit about what you've learned? That's exciting. How many have you done already?
We've done 2 so far.
Okay.
We're doing listening tours in states where there were close election issues. So we kicked it off in Georgia. We were in Michigan. We're going to be in Pennsylvania tomorrow. And we've learned a lot. I think it's been very enlightening because at each session we've had a panel of election workers, because in addition to not understanding civics, I think large swaths of the population don't really know how elections are conducted. And I think the key to all of this is, you know, what we heard in the earlier panels as well, is education. And we have a panel with election workers, and I think it's very illuminating. We have gotten students involved, but more importantly, it's not a one and done. We're bringing the community together, not just lawyers, because everybody should be involved. And we have next step committees who are organizing and galvanizing up through the election. And then, you know, unfortunately, what we saw on January 6th, probably the time that's most important is actually after the election. And so they're going to continue their work through then as well.
And how many of these listening groups will you have?
We're having 6 major ones, but one of the things we're doing is we're encouraging state and local bars. We're doing 6, Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Arizona, and Nevada, but we're encouraging state and local bars to do them themselves. So for instance, the New York State Bar is doing a virtual one on May 21st. So we have several else going on, either virtually in person, because we need to engage state and local bars.
Terrific, very exciting. So Jennifer Doan, I want to come to you next.
Okay.
You might say that you, as a trial lawyer, a very accomplished trial lawyer from Texas, have been kind of at the front edge of some of the issues, I'm certain, because I'm guessing, how many jury trials might you have done?
Oh gosh, almost 75 at this point. There's a lot. But I've been a trial lawyer. I just went to my 35th law school reunion. So, and you know,
once again, we violated the, what do we say, the child labor law in
yes, it was
right?
definitely a child prodigy and started when I was 10. I think that we see it as trial lawyers, especially with not only the American Board of Trial Advocates, but other trial bars as well. We see the issues with respect to the people that serve on our juries. And if you don't understand how our justice system works and how our country is set up, then we have people that think the system's broken because they listen to different either social media or what's on the news, and they think, okay, I'm not going to show up for jury duty. And if you don't show up for jury duty, that hurts both sides. It takes all willing participants, all citizens, to show up for jury duty to make sure that both sides get a fair trial. So it affects not only plaintiffs' lawyers, but defendants' lawyers as well. I think that's where we really first see the lack of education.
Do you have a way of telling us how jurors react after a trial is finished? I mean, what's been your experience there?
So the majority of my trials are in federal court. And I will tell you, the federal court system with our federal judges, they start out with the jury trial explaining that other than serving in the military, this is the greatest service that you can give as an American citizen, is to show up and listen to a case and make a decision on the facts. I mean, the judge makes the decision on the law, obviously, but the jury makes the decision on the facts. And it takes, depending on whether you're in state court or federal court, you have to have at least 6 jurors. I think you can go down to 5 with the agreement of the parties, but most states have 12 jurors.
And how do the jurors react, do you think?
They love it. They did not realize, at the beginning, they always think, I hope I don't get picked. What can I raise my hand for? Oh, yes, I know them. Or, oh, yes, I have a hardship. And they're always trying to get off. And then the judge will talk to them, explain why it's so important that we have a diverse group of citizenry listening to the facts of this case. And afterwards, they always appreciate how much this process has meant to them and how important it was. Some of them may say, I really tried to get off, but that was a huge mistake, and I can't wait to tell people about it. They always appreciate it.
Now, I think you have an experience working with the tech sector too, don't you?
So a lot of our
Talk to us about them.
A lot of our clients are in the tech industry, and it's really important when we're bringing patent infringement cases, or you're defending a patent infringement case for a major tech industry. One of the reasons I think that I've done this for the last almost 20 years now is because I tried so many other cases in personal injury and products liabilities and for the pharmaceutical companies before patent infringement litigation really took a real stronghold in this nation and litigation over that. And you need to be able to tell a story, and you need to be able to explain why this is important, that the jury understands this issue. And I think that the tech industry really sees, all companies though, see having a jury that understands why we are here and what the rule of law is about and why my decisions make a difference and why I need to be here and how that interplays. It's so important to them. So when they leave at the end of the day for the juries, or if you're there watching the jury trial, you know that one party wins in a jury trial and one party does not win, usually. And it could be that there's multiple issues and somebody wins something and somebody wins something else, but ultimately there's one party that does a little bit better than the other. And to understand, if one party doesn't like that or the facts show differently, you can appeal the issue if you do not like it, and understand the process, the judicial process of what we go through.
So let's talk for just a minute about some of these tech sector clients. There's been some mention in the earlier panels that there's a little tension between, if you will, those with a STEM education background and those with history and so on, and the comment made that there's been a great rush to do more in STEM, frankly, in kind of a rob Peter to pay Paul strategy, taking time away from civic education as students go through their K through 12 years. And I guess I would say to you, Mary, ironically, notwithstanding the wonderful thing that was done to kick off Law Day back in 1958, it turns out that another thing was happening then, and that was responding to Sputnik with greater attention on tech kinds of topics. And so we kind of were doing two things that were not necessarily well synchronized. How would you say, Jennifer, your tech clients understand, appreciate the value of civic education when they've experienced the court system and a trial with you guiding them?
I think it's imperative. I mean, they do understand the court system, especially the people in the legal department for the clients that we represent. But it doesn't have to be, and I don't think anybody in this room or listening would have said back when STEM was started, because if you'll remember, America was falling behind in the world with respect to science and math and technology, and especially when you saw the number of women that were being educated in science and math and technology and other nations versus America, we were really far behind. So we wanted to increase that, and then we really brought it to women and young girls in elementary school. So it was all great purposes for what we did. And nobody in this room thought, we're going to do that and we're going to cut out civics. Because if they'd said that, we'd have thought, oh, no, we're not going to bring STEM to the detriment of civics. But as it turned out, that's what's happened. But why can't you have both? Why couldn't you have really strong science and engineering and math and technology and also a really strong democracy? You should be able to have both well. We haven't done that in our education system to date, but that doesn't mean it can't change for the better. But
well, so the good news here, when we talk about it, is that you're doing some terrific work in trying to educate those who are in the various parts of our educational system who may themselves have not gotten the kind of preparation they needed. And it's been said by one who knows that your program for teaching teachers about civic education is probably the best that exists for adults. Can you say a little bit about?
We're really proud of our Teachers Law School.
There you go.
So we have 7,300 members. We have 95 chapters. We're in all 50 states. And each of the chapters is in charge of having some type of Teachers Law School. So we have them throughout the nation. Back in 2017, we did have our first and ever National Teachers Law School here in Washington, D.C. And this summer, we're having a Civic Summit where we're having teachers from all over the nation come here. It's going to be held at the National Archives in July. But our Teachers Law School program brings in teachers, and we address not only the issues that they see in school, because what teachers really want to know is, how do I deal with search and seizure out of lockers? You know, what if somebody brings some contraband into school? How do I deal with that? So we address those problems, but we also address teaching them to teach their children about the three branches of government and why it's so important. And when you're in high school, because it's your junior high and high school teachers, you're teaching people that are about to be 18, and they're going to be able to be on juries, some of them, while they're still in high school, and why it's so important to be called for that task. But in addition, because of the success for that program, which has been going on for years, we also now have, we've had it for years, on the West Coast, we have a journalist law school at Loyola, and in the East Coast, we have a media law school. Because part of some of the problems are, it's for our journalists or our media, our correspondents, who may not know the full process of a jury trial or what happens after that, or the independence of the judiciary or the rule of law, and bringing them together to remind them of those issues as well, making sure that our journalists and our media are also very well educated.
So I think it's pretty clear that we have two leaders of very prominent legal organizations who are passionate about addressing the civics education gap. But Mary, let me come back to you. Do you think your members share the same level of enthusiasm, concern, and commitment that you have personally, or is there some education to be done of the lawyer community as well?
Well, I know that a lot of our members share the same concern, but you know, I'm sure there are members. We're a large organization, and I know, to follow up on what Jennifer said, is the independence of the judiciary is so important, and we had a remarkable thing happen recently where, you know, judges, particularly federal judges, as you know, will not speak to the media. And we've seen increasing attacks on our judiciary, and the judiciary is an important element of our democracy. And Judge Reggie Walton from here in DC appeared on CNN, I think, because he's personally been attacked, but just to stand up for the judiciary. And it reminded me that we, as you know, as lawyers, need to stand up for the judiciary. So I issued a statement saying that, you know, judges should not be fear for their life by simply doing their job. And it's imperative for us as lawyers to stand up and speak out and fulfill our obligations that we took. When each of us became lawyers, all of us took an oath to uphold the Constitution and the rule of law. And that oath should carry all of us every single day. And I got a lot of positive comments from my statement, but the interesting thing is I got some interesting comments from the statement, and to me, I think it kind of plays into what you're talking about in terms of media, because we see different people getting information from different ways. There's a lot of misinformation out there, and certain of the people, and I probably would be able to guess maybe where they're getting some of their information from, we're talking about the corruption of judges. Sure, is every judge perfect? No, but I would say the vast majority of them are hardworking public servants, but yet that is floating out there to undermine our democratic institutions.
And I suppose it should be pointed out to people that if you don't like a decision,
you can appeal.
Exactly right. So you're saying, I think, there may not be what we say, a formal ethical obligation or a code of conduct that requires lawyers to stand up and defend judges, but that ought to be part of their ethos. Mm-hmm. Okay. Let me ask you this as well, Mary. We talk about the rule of law, but we're not going to be able to put everything that's important into black letter law. There are norms of conduct and so on. How does the ABA deal with that issue? You are, of course, an organization of lawyers.
Well, we do promulgate the model rules of professional conduct that get adopted in each state. But I think, you know, I have an interesting story about that because I have served 2 stints at the U.S. Department of Justice as a trial attorney and then part of the leadership of one of the divisions. And I was asked when our previous president was entering office what the impact would be on the Department of Justice. And I thought that we had enduring principles and institutional basis for things, the way things work at the U.S. Department of Justice, and we do. But I realized, just like our democracy, things are very fragile. They're resilient, but we cannot take them for granted. And as you point out, certain things are not written into like a statute or a regulation. They're just norms that we have adopted in our country.
So would these also be the kinds of things that ought to be taught in some of the courses that OBOTA has been sponsoring and working with? Not just black letter law, but conduct.
Yeah, definitely conduct. So, and I don't think we want conduct to be codified where it has to be A, B, C, D, E, F, or you're wrong. It needs to be the principles, and then we act within those principles, because it needs to be more fluid than that. Not fragile, but fluid as long as this is the parameters for what is ethical, and this is the parameters for what is professional, and to operate within in that conduct.
So let's come to, I think, what is really the thesis of what we're trying to talk about today, and that is, I think lawyers ought to be stewards of our Constitution and I should say our legal system and norms of conduct and so forth and ethics. But we're really concerned to reach out to the business community, and lawyers have a very important relationship with the business community as clients. They represent them. They're leaders in their communities as well. What would you say about their ability to influence their clients and try to stimulate them into programs that might provide, in a nonpartisan way, education on civics? And maybe I'll start with you, Mary.
Well, I mean, law is a profession, but it's also a business. So I would start, there's so many law firms in this country, and they can infuse teaching civics even in programs at law firms. And then, of course, I want to commend our previous panelists at the Chamber and Travelers, because we've seen in Microsoft companies who are doing this already. So I know we're working with general counsels and others to try to engage the business community. And also, frankly, I know you're teaching, I think, teachers about civics, but actually, frankly, at law schools are not even teaching civics.
I was hoping you would get to that, yes.
And one of the things we're kind of working on behind the scenes, so stay tuned, we're getting a letter signed by numerous law school deans to support that at the law school level.
I'm curious to know whether you might have an opportunity with summer associates who are soon to be lawyers but come to law school without proper civic education either.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because we actually, one of the things the task force is doing is we're planning a series of 4 webinars, and they're targeted at young lawyers, but we hope to capture that summer associate class. And it's a series of 4 webinars talking about our democracy and other issues. And then finally, the 4th one is, what can you do? So those should be coming out in June and July.
All right. Well, that's terrific.
That's excellent. I think that's definitely, for the
Now, let me go back to you, Jennifer, though, because I know you're in immediate contact with many clients. How do you see their response to the kind of push we're hoping we can generate?
I have yet to have a client say, no, we're not going to engage in civic education within our company. I think a lot of, especially when you look at clients who may be my age or older, are surprised that it's not being taught, disappointed that it's not being taught, but it's an easy conversation to have. You're not asking them necessarily to donate in this part of the conversation. You're just asking them, what do they do within their own company? And would you be amenable to having a program brought into your company to teach your workers? Because not everybody is a programmer. Not everyone's a software engineer. Not everyone's in upper management. A lot of our clients have everyday workers that show up just to do their job, and thousands of them.
So to both of you, do you think that our lawyer force, if you will, would be willing to serve kind of in an educational role here to help with some of these programs that we hope businesses are going to begin to think about developing themselves?
I definitely think so. Mm-hmm. I mean, the 3 things at Abona, our tenants, are we're obviously all civil trial lawyers, so it's to promote the 7th Amendment right to trial by jury. Next is to defend the independence of the judiciary. And the 3rd is to uphold the rule of law. And we do all of that through civic education. I think you mentioned education early on as being one of the most important things, education. I think education is a dividing line in our nation. Some people think it's wealth and not wealth, but if you're educated, you can choose what you decide to do. If you're not educated, you may not be able to choose.
And you think then that lawyers might have a role here to play in this?
Definitely.
I think, Mary, that's probably the thesis that you're working with too. But
Oh, yeah, lawyers, I think, have a big role. I view lawyers as the keepers of democracy. And we, like I said, we all take that oath the very day we become lawyers. So I know at the American Bar Association, just every law day, we send lawyers out into classrooms to teach about civics. And just funny story about that. When I was at the Department of Justice, I brought in some students to meet with my boss. And I love students' questions. They actually asked him, could he name all the presidents in order? And he did it. And I was like, oh my gosh. But it's great because we do that every year. And I know a lot of judges do that as well.
So I want to turn to the general public and the level of knowledge that you think currently they have. There's been a lot of mention of this, but the ABA, I think since, is it 2018, you began doing a survey every year, right around Law Day, and I think the survey this year was released in April 23rd, if I'm not mistaken. Can you say anything about what you learned in that survey this year?
Yeah, we do an annual survey of civic literacy. It's the 6th year we're doing it, and I think the results are enlightening, but probably not surprising for those in the room and those listening on the live stream. 74% of U.S. residents say America's system of democracy is weaker than it was 5 years ago. And they say the main cause of the downward spiral is the spread of misinformation and disinformation. And I thought one of the more interesting questions of the survey, they asked, gets to your questions, Elizabeth, who is responsible for safeguarding democracy? 25% said the judiciary, and only 1 in 5, like 21%, said it's public officials. The biggest percentage of people, 37%, said it's all of us. And so when I first heard those results, I thought, I guess I can be a pessimist sometimes because I thought, oh my gosh, only about 20% of people think our public officials are responsible for democracy. But then someone pointed out to look at it in a different way. No, it's actually a positive because the biggest percentage of people thought that all of us are responsible for democracy.
So you stimulate this comment. I think the one positive thing surveys show is that there's a huge thirst for more education on civic topics. And that, I gather, is kind of what you've picked up in this survey, which I think brings me to my last question. I want to be mindful of time here, but you both have so many different programs. I suspect we're going to see that there are going to be people out there who want to know how they can get involved. Jennifer, what would you say to a lawyer or not a lawyer? What could they do to participate in some of the work you're doing?
Yeah, to a lawyer or to a business that wanted to be involved in particular, if you would either go to abota.org, list all of our programs there. You can see there's an email to send to get involved there, or to support different programs. We have a number of sponsors that are supporting our National Civic Summit here in Washington, D.C. this summer, which we think is fantastic because those companies are getting behind actually supporting educating teachers all over the nation so that they can go home back in their states in California or Florida or Oregon or Nebraska or Michigan, Minnesota or Texas and teach all the students in their organization.
Terrific. So we don't all just have to listen, we can actually do.
Actually do.
All right. And Mary, how about you?
Well, I think the first thing is just volunteer. I loved Richard Haas's idea that businesses they have affinity groups. They could have a democracy affinity group. I know if you want to hear more about the ABA Task Force for American Democracy, go to ambar.org/democracy and tune in tomorrow. It's going to be a fabulous program. Both the judge and the secretary are going to be there. And we also have what was started under my predecessor, Deborah Enix-Ross, poll worker-esque. So we ask lawyers to volunteer as poll workers during elections.
That's great.
Wonderful. And I'm gathering you don't have to be a lawyer to volunteer.
You don't
as
have to be a
poll
lawyer.
watcher. Okay.
You don't actually have to be a lawyer to be a member of the American Bar Association, so everyone, please join.
Okay, there we go. Well, maybe I'll round this out by just saying that I came to this whole issue from a national security background, convinced that we have a national security imperative to address our civic education gap. And that's important no matter what sector you look at. I'm wondering, final words from both of you. Would you agree with that comment?
You know, we talked about earlier where there's an ethical obligation. I don't think we have an ethical obligation to do that. I think we have, it should be a professional imperative to make sure we address civics education with every aspect, not just students, with adults within businesses, within teachers, and with respect to our social media companies, because so many of our adults or children get information through social media, and there is so much disinformation out there that you could have journalists and the media get it right, and then you have these social media posts as well. So it's so important.
So really trying to leverage our legal training and background to make it available to every sector, but importantly, the business community.
Every sector. It doesn't necessarily even take a legal education to understand what a democracy is. It's just being educated. So the panel before us raised the term a democratic republic, and you may be talking to someone who doesn't even understand what a democratic republic is because they think, no, you're either a Democrat or a Republican, and they immediately go to politics and not realizing how our government is set up. So everybody should understand how our government is set up. It doesn't take a lawyer to do that.
And Mary, final word from you.
Well,
this is really a matter of great concern, fundamental to the strength of our democracy. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, no, and Elizabeth, to your point about national security concerns, the UN has recognized that the rule of law creates stable economic environments, and even myself sometimes, you don't realize that the foundation of democracy affects so many aspects of our life, like to have a thriving business community, you need to have, I think, a stable democracy. And one story, because the ABA, we do law in all different areas, and I love this one story that I was looking into climate change and reading about Greta Thunberg, and she was doing these meetings every Friday in person. And when the pandemic started, she started doing them virtually. And the one advantage of that was she had been meeting with people in Europe, but once they started doing it virtually, they started including people from South America, Africa, and they would talk about how they're trying to address climate change in their countries. And the Europeans were a little bit not recognizing things, because they'd say to people in a less developed country, well, why don't you just do this? And then finally someone said on a call, you don't realize we cannot do that in our country. And then Greta had this little light bulb moment where she said, in order to address climate change, we need democracy.
And I suspect we could say that in any number of contexts. And that's why it's so important to have democracy here. Well, I want to thank the two of you, busy as you are, for all the very, very important work you're doing.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for being part of our panel. Thank you so much.
Very exciting conversation.
Well, that was outstanding. Thank you so much. And I have to just say thank you to Aboda and Jennifer. Aboda has been a wonderful supporter of our Civics at Work initiative. And in fact, the former head of the Aboda Foundation recognized that law firms are also businesses and signed up for Civics at Work. So I encourage all the law firms out there to know that this discussion about the role of business applies to you as a business entity as well. But Aboda has been a wonderful supporter and collaborator and advisor as we've gone along, and particularly Jennifer, thank you so much. And the ABA's commitment to this civic education and democracy, so beautifully reflected in the work that Mary has set up, the task force, and the work that goes on across the ABA. And I know that your predecessor, as you mentioned, Deborah Enix-Ross, created the Cornerstones of Democracy Commission, which I have the honor to sit on and serve on. And it's great to see and so vitally important. As I say, I think reinstilling a sense of what it means to be in a system under the rule of law is going to be critically important in the next several months as we move forward, particularly in the election context. So thank you for all that you're doing. And this conversation will continue. If you just haven't had enough, in just a couple days, on May 2nd, I will be sitting down with Judge Michael Ludig to talk about this importance of the rule of law and the role of business in sustaining our democracy. That'll be co-hosted by the University of Virginia's Karsh Institute on Democracy. If you want to know more about the work that CSIS is doing, csis.org, and just search for civics, and you'll find all of the things that we're doing here, and the guide that we put out that will link you to resources that you've heard about today that are out there, including the U.S. Chamber and many others. Those of you who were nice enough, kind enough to come and sit here in person for this wonderful conversation, I hope you will join us at the reception. And for all of those who tuned in live stream or are watching this on demand, thank you for your interest. And please join me in a round of applause for our final panel.